My name is Justin Manley. I'm the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the Marine Technology Society. And our objective here was to pull together a session where we could present a variety of topic areas related to environmental monitoring, ocean observation, and of course the recent oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And passed around a flyer, hopefully everyone's got a chance to look at it. Tells you a little bit about who we're going to hear from and what the topics are. We're going to start off, I do have a video address from Congressman Baird, who's from the next district over. This is not his district, but he's nearby. He's also a passionate advocate for the oceans. Unfortunately for the oceans, Congressman Baird is not actually running for re-election, but hopefully that will make his remarks even a little more entertaining and to the point for us. So we're going to start by trying to play that, and I'm going to do my best to hold the microphone in a way so you can listen in and hear it, and it'll play up there. And then Zdenko Willis is going to speak to us for a few minutes and discuss the Integrated Ocean Observing System, which is a NOAA program, and a national network of tools, techniques, and organizations trying to observe the ocean. From there, we're going to have Fritz Starr from the School of Oceanography here in the University of Washington speak to us from a research perspective, the academic perspective. Fritz also took some testimony to the Hill in front of Senator Cantwell, and we'll probably hear a little bit of the same remarks he offered there. Jeff Taylor, who is with Mercury, professional government relations firm in Washington, D.C., under contract to the Marine Technology Society. He works for us there and helps us raise our awareness with government. He's going to speak to us about those folks on Capitol Hill, the legislators from both sides of the aisle who have some interest in this subject and what we might see coming down from those various individuals. I'm going to wrap up in a half shameless self-promotion, but in an effort to bring the story back to a technology discussion, tell you a little bit about a recent development from the unmanned vehicle space with my own company and my day job, Liquid Robotics. From there, we're going to try to leave a lot of time for Q&A and open dialogue. The other thing I'm going to do here, if you've got a pencil, I encourage you all to sort of jot down my email address or my cell phone number, and I'll pass a couple of business cards. The idea here is for the Q&A, so you can certainly write your questions down, and you're welcome to stand up and offer your question. But also, everybody's got an iPhone or a BlackBerry or a tool here. Shoot me a text message or an email with your question, particularly if you're perhaps interested in not acknowledging the direction your question is coming from. And my job will be to sort of pull all those together. I'll pull the interesting ones out and try to keep the dialogue flowing. So we've used this technique before at some MTS panels. It actually worked quite well. It sounds a little hokey, I understand, but it does work pretty well. So that's the agenda here for the day. And the topic, again, is to really bring together the multidisciplinary aspects of this particular subject. So with that, I'm going to do my best to play this address from Congressman Baird in a way that hopefully you can all hear it over the speakers and see it on the screen.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to join you at the Oceans 2010 conference. I'm very sorry I can't be with you today, but congressional duties require me to be at what we call back home the other Washington. Still, I hope you make the most of your time in Seattle and have a wonderful stay there. As some of you know, I've long been a champion for oceans and ocean-related research. I'm happy to be able to contribute to your discussion today about ocean observation and environmental management, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. As some are aware, I wrote the legislation to create an ocean acidification research program at NOAA, and I've been the lead champion for research and development of legislation for harmful algal blooms and hypoxia. Most recently, I've been working on an ocean-related energy bill along with my Washington colleague, Jay Inslee. In addition, I'm an avid scuba diver, and have dived around the world to observe the impacts firsthand of climate change and ocean acidification on our ocean ecosystems. I just returned from diving at the Aquarius Reef Base, the world's only permanent undersea research station. Aquarius is located in the Florida Keys and could provide a very useful tool for long-term monitoring of the impacts of the oil spill and dispersants from the Deepwater Horizon event. This summer, in the midst of Deepwater Horizon, I had the privilege of traveling to the Gulf where I saw the response to the disaster up close. It is massive. However, we must have the most advanced tools to get the job done properly. That's why, as chair of the House Science and Technology Committee and our Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment, I've been working closely with Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey on oil spill research and development legislation since 2009. The spill in the Gulf is, in fact, precisely the kind of event we were trying to prepare for with our legislation. Now, the public is asking what went wrong that allowed this to happen, What are we doing now to get it cleaned up? They also want to know how we prevent future spills, and if a spill does happen, what can we do to better prepare to respond and mitigate the impacts? Our committee held a number of hearings on these issues and then passed out of the House 2 bills to address these questions. H.R. 2693 is the Oil Pollution Research and Development Program Reauthorization Act of 2010, and H.R. 5716 is the Safer Oil and Natural Gas Drilling Technology Research and Development Act. These bills address the current gaps in federal research, development, and demonstration relating to oil spill prevention, response, and safety capabilities. During our committee hearings, the witnesses discussed several issues, including the need for international cooperation on research, difficulties with sharing data between the federal response team and academic scientists, the hurdles associated with getting research and technology in the water for real-world testing and implementation, and a number of other measures. Our committee added provisions to address all of these issues. Specifically, we added language to encourage cooperation and coordination on research and development within and across foreign nations. We also added language to make research available to federal response teams during an oil spill emergency. We worked to allow for the pre-staging of technologies for cleanup and research studies for real-time deployment in the event of a spill. Now, more than ever, we need scientists, engineers, explorers, and entrepreneurs like those of you at this meeting to conduct research and develop practical ways to address these environmental issues in the Gulf and wherever else they may occur. I'm hopeful our legislation helps make that possible, and I know the results of your meeting today will help facilitate that as well. Thank you for the privilege of chatting with you. Have a wonderful meeting, and we look forward to working together in the future. Again, I'm Congressman Brian Baird. Thanks for your time.
All right. So hopefully some of that message carried back. I know it was a little faint. Did folks in the back, did you at least get much of that content? Did it come through a bit? Otherwise, I'll sort of recap here. The couple of things you heard Congressman remark. He's certainly a fan of the Aquarius Reef Base. Those of us who know him weren't surprised to hear that. But also talked about a bunch of legislation and some interest they've got and the idea of being prepared. And I'd summarize here by saying what you see there is an example of a motivated and very engaged member of Congress about a lot of the issues we all care about. What we're going to do here is we'll try to make arrangements so that this can be available behind some log-on access. We were asked not to sort of send this globally out into the full ether, but I will try to get permission to put that behind some member access on the MTS or the IEEE website, so those of you who want to go back and see it again can. You can always come catch up with me, and we can play it for you here where you can hear. So I'm going to hand over to Zdenka Willis, and she can tell us about
I'll stand. You can. So good afternoon. I'm not going to go into a full IUSE presentation, and I'm not going to be able to, in the short time, because we want to have discussion, talk about all the observing activities that IUSE and that NOAA did for the Gulf spill. I appreciate that Craig McLean is here. He is our acting assistant administrator for our ocean atmospheric research, who is very much a part of the leadership team in NOAA, looking at the science and looking at the observing. So the caveat is this is not the full breath, so I wouldn't be up here for an hour discussing. And Craig also, I appreciate that he's here to be able to maybe provide during the discussion additional observing that I'm not going to go over. So next slide. So really, I'm going to talk about 3 elements, and the reason that I chose these 3 is because it was rather new to the oil spill response in a major way. The first one being high-frequency radar, the second one being glider, and the third one being the satellite data that we used. And so there are a couple of points that I want to make on this slide. So high-frequency radar is, we have nominally about 110 of these systems around the country, and they provide surface currents. The longest continuous line of these HF radars actually here on the West Coast, and basically goes from Oregon down to the southern border of California. And this technology is really important and very helpful in understanding the trajectory of oil on the surface. And a couple of key points on this slide is you can't have a crisis and come to the party when the crisis happens. You have to actually have been involved with those who are responsible to do the forecast well prior to the crisis so that your information can be useful. And while I started this timeline in 2006, I can tell you that it was actually well before then that we started working with NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration to be able to make sure that the data that the high-frequency radar systems were delivering were actually in a format that they could use directly with their models and had the appropriate QA, QC, and something we call gap filling. So we started that education in 2006 in an exercise called Safe Seas on the West Coast. It was put into practice in the COSCO Busan in December of 2007. And so we were ready from a data perspective. Well, as fate would have it, when the oil rig blew up, 2 of the 3 radars in the northern Mississippi coast were down for scheduled maintenance. Actually, we had a beach renourishment project going on, so the center radar was out. They wanted to move the western radar and to make it a more efficient array, and the eastern radar was up and running. But because of, again, the systematic ability to having worked this prior to the crisis, we were able to get permission to get the HF radar back up online, and within 3 days, the radars were back up online and again instantaneously available on this national server that we have, the National Data Buoy Center, and at Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and directly into the folks in Seattle. So, but you can see that we have radars up in the northern part of the Gulf of Mexico, and we have along the coast of Florida. So we don't have them everywhere, and in fact there was a push to get additional radars in a surge capacity that in the end was not funded by the responders, so that did not happen. But so again, we've got a system out there partially, and I think that's that's one of the messages. Next slide. The second technology that was brought to bear, which is new for an oil spill, is gliders. So in this case, it's the gliders, the benthic gliders that use ballast to go from the surface down to about 1,000 meters. And at one point in time, we had 9 gliders in theater, of which 7 of those come from non-federal assets. We had 2 Navy gliders in there. And this again talks to the partnership of not only as, and the same one on the, with HF Radar because we have an industry partner there, but the partnership of the federal and the non-federal in a coherent way. We can't just put these vehicles in the water and not get it coordinated with the incident commander, because the incident commander's got about a 24-hour clock that they've got to respond to every day. And so what was really great about using this IU system, and you'll notice that a lot of the folks had gliders were not organic to the Gulf of Mexico. But again, because we have this IU system in place, we have these regional coastal ocean observing. They are partnered with industry, CODAR for our HF radar, in this case iRobot for sea gliders, Teledyne Web Research on the Slocums, and Spray comes out of Scripps in this particular case. We were able to bring in gliders from other areas, and again, same thing, the data we used instantaneously. They needed to get the data onto something called the GTS, the Global Telecommunications Service, which is what modelers use to be able to automatically assimilate that data into their models. And so we set up a website at Rutgers that housed all of this glider data in one location. That's not to say that those who are driving from UW and Woods Hole and Scripps weren't vital to that, but again, the responders need to be able to go to a single location. So we were able to do that and get the data flowing out on the GTS, again, for immediate use. And you don't just do that at the time of crisis. You have to have had that partnership and those data formats developed well before a crisis occurs. Next slide. So the other thing that really, the other observing asset that really came through in support of the oil spill is the use of the satellite imagery. Be it the radar sat imagery, the synthetic aperture radar, which is RadarSat, and MARIS, the MODIS, the visible, the infrared. So within NOAA and in combination, you see a lot of logos down here on the bottom with our federal partners, our industry partners. Again, how do we bring this new capability to bear in a crisis and an oil spill that didn't just happen and contain itself in a week? You know, it was 100 days before we capped this. So this is some interesting work that was done on a day-to-day basis. And finally, one last slide is, and then the research that was being done to exploit these data sets in new ways. And that, again, was very much using our academic partners inside in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as, you know, through the country, the partnerships that we have, to be able to use this in exploratory ways. So I'm going to finish there, so we do have time for Q&A, but I'm going to ask Craig if there's anything that I really missed that I should, at this point, tell folks about from an observing perspective, or we can wait till the discussion.
Thank you. There are two. I'm sorry. There are two comments I would offer in terms of an observing component. One is, I think the scale and scope of Deepwater Horizon was by far in excess of what anyone ever expected to be an impact to a body of water like the Gulf of Mexico, that we as a nation were not prepared with an observing system that could monitor the Gulf in such a scale and for such a response. The other component that I think in observing that I want to extend a comment that you had offered, Stanka, was that the capacity of the academic excellence that existed in and around the Gulf and across the nation was ready to be engaged, and that was very inspiring. I think the nation needs to, in an organizational way, plan more heavily on recruiting and incorporating academic capability to come in and help the federal response to understand what the impacts are as it's happening. But again, the scale and the scope of Deepwater was by far greater than anything to an organization that routinely handles from 120 to 150 oil spills a year. That's what our nation, between the Coast Guard, NOAA, EPA, and others, are handling. So we're not rookies at this, but we're certainly rookies at looking at something as big as Deepwater was.
Thanks, and actually that's an exceptional transition because our next speaker, Fritz Starr, comes to us from that academic and research background, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to leave this slide up. Or you...
So, no, you should be wired in here. Any rate, I'm sorry, I'm Fritz Starr, the University of Washington. I run a little center there that makes sea gliders. You've heard that we had sea gliders out in the Gulf. And I want to say thanks to iRobot Corporation. It was actually their glider that went in first. The Navy called me first. They're the first ones who said, hey, what would happen if a glider was swimming around in oil? And I said, let me guess. Your command has tasked you to put some of your sea gliders in the Gulf of Mexico. Oh, why, yes, as a matter of fact. So I got dragged into it in that aspect quickly, and I was very glad that as a new observing platform, gliders were put to use to look at the subsea effect of this spill. Spill is really the wrong word for what happened. Spill implies it was once in a container. The only container this oil was ever in before it entered the Gulf of Mexico was the center of the earth, right? Underground. And it came out at the sea floor, not out of a ship and onto the surface. It came out at 1,500 meters deep. And it came out in the form that hopefully Justin's going to find us a little video clip of. You probably all remember the infamous first 30-second video clip that we all finally saw of an oil vent. That's what this thing was, a vent. And it very much parallels something that I studied as a postdoc, which is a subsea hydrothermal vent. You may know of them as black smokers. Many of you may have seen them on Nova or some other science show. These are places on the seafloor where the tectonic plates are, seafloor crust is being created, water circulating down into the crust, heated by the magma, comes out at 200 to 400 degrees centigrade, mixes with the surrounding water, precipitates out all these minerals, and it literally looks like a plume from a chimney on land of black smoke. And the forces that were happening at the wellhead are almost identical to the forces happening at the orifice of a black smoker. And it was sort of from that background that, as a scientist, I looked at this thing and I thought, gosh, I hope they've got some vent guys working on this. But you know what? There really weren't. And it was one of my colleagues actually who first published something in the New York Times saying, if I were to take this 30-second video and actually analyze it, which he did, I would guess that there are approximately 50,000 barrels a day coming out of this oil vent. And at the time, the published number was 5,000. At first, somebody said 5,000 gallons. It's like, no, there's a problem. There's a unit problem there. This is barrels a day, but actually it was the ultimate final number that the flow rate technical group, which was ultimately formed in very late May, early June, came out to 55,000 barrels a day. Although there were numbers floating around early on of more like 100,000 barrels a day. So in fact, you're absolutely right that there are a lot of us who are out there who were very interested and in fact willing to step forward and help out. There was no mechanism to include that. Fortunately, the IUCE mechanism for engagement of a number of non-federal folks in research about the general environment and observing the Gulf was already in place, and that mechanism was able to react and include a bunch of folks, particularly from University of Georgia, Florida, University of Southern Mississippi, Vern Asper, who, this is their backyard. This is where they study anyway. This is what they do anyway. They wanted to participate and were able to help the nation, really, in trying to understand this thing. But the deep ocean vent community, for the most part, as far as I know, kind of sat by and watched. And some of us watched thinking, what the heck's going on here? There are ways of doing this. There are ways of estimating this flow rate. We just need better access. And ultimately, it turns out that some of that happened. It never made the press necessarily, but it did happen.
I'm trying to spare you a bunch of advertisements.
Oh.
Limited, so
All right. All I'm trying to show up here really is, how many people have seen pictures from the wellhead and that plume? All right. So you don't have to do this, Justin. Sorry. I hate to not give you a job, but
The Huffington Post website came up first.
Oh, really? Oh, there's some stuff on YouTube. There's stuff on YouTube. One of the issues is that most, as you might think, oil's buoyant, so it comes out of the ground on the seafloor at 1,500 meters. Why doesn't it just go to the surface and stay there and not mix with the water around it? And the real fact of the matter is it was coming out at such a high pressure, and the buoyancy was so different that there's a tremendous amount of shear in the water column. And that shear that's happening and all that violent, turbulent mixing that's happening in the first 100 or 200 meters as it comes out of that wellhead is creating tiny, tiny, tiny little particles of oil and dispersant. By the way, we tried a new experiment. No one had ever done this. Let's inject 2 million gallons of dispersant in there with this oil that's coming out at 1,500 meters deep. What's going to happen? Oh, I don't know. We still don't know. At any rate, it made a big neutrally buoyant plume underwater. How many people have heard of the plume, right? So the plume was an issue also. Is there a plume? Oh, I don't know, maybe. Well, sure enough, it didn't take too long before we found pretty solid evidence of the plume. But how do you observe the plume? That's another issue, right? The gliders are out there, but they have an instrument that could only act as a proxy instrument, measuring colored dissolved organic matter. So instruments that can directly measure oil, well, those aren't available on gliders yet. That's a little bit of work that needs to be done still. And then there's the issue of, well, how big is the plume? Where is it going to go? Well, that's a matter of understanding in 3 dimensions the current pattern in the Gulf of Mexico. How do we know about that? Well, we don't really know about that because there are some observations. Actually, the Gulf of Mexico is better instrumented than many other places because now oil platforms that are drilling in deeper than 400 meters of water have to have ADCPs on them. And that ADCP data is being collected by the National Buoy Data Center. Dick Kraut gave a talk about that this morning or yesterday, right, and so there you go, right? So this violent action right here, that's what's creating that underwater plume that went neutrally buoyant at somewhere between 800 meters and about 1,300 meters, and spread around and got big, and so one of the things that happens when you end up with a situation like that is that those tiny little oil particles don't see 2 things that can weather them at the surface that most oil spill response depends on, the air and the sun. They never make it to either of those. So the only way this stuff breaks down is microbial action, We know that there's microbes in the Gulf of Mexico that can do that, but what we don't know is how robust they were, how well they could, deal with this. So there were just a whole lot of questions associated with this plume. Again, the folks who have looked at hydrothermal vents have looked at plumes and measured how plumes move a little bit over seafloor vents, et cetera. So another connection to a piece of science that's out there with resources that are out there, that because of the nature of the organization of spill response, it's that word spill that drives the thinking. Spill is something that happens at the surface. How do we deal with it at the surface? We're just unprepared, really, from both a technology standpoint and an understanding standpoint, to deal with it when it starts at 1,500 meters deep or even deeper, as they're now drilling deeper and deeper wells, starting at seafloor that's 1,600, 1,700 meters deep. Someday they'll get down to the flat abyssal plain in the Gulf, which is, I think, order 3,000 meters or something like that. But any rate, so that's kind of a perspective from sitting here in Seattle and watching it all unfold, and being in a school of oceanography in which some of this expertise resides, and thinking, gosh, I wonder how I could help. And
No, thanks, Chris.
so, yeah, thank you for your work, Tom.
I'm always happy to help surf YouTube. So again, I think there's a story being told here, right? There's a response, there's a reaction, there's a tool set. You're already hearing a little bit about the interplay between certain government infrastructure and observation and research questions, right? And we all come at this field from different angles, but we're starting to see some overlap. This is where I sort of shift gears, remind everyone that MTS and IEEE OES both have an interest in a multidisciplinary outlook. In fact, in the MTS world, we have a committee on marine law and policy, for example, right, a technical committee. And so we're going to shift gears here, and we're going to listen to some of the information about the governmental legislative response and what's going on in the halls of power and influence, other than what we may or may not have been able to catch due to the low quality audio from Congressman Baird. So Jeff, I'm going to give you the microphone, and I'm going to drive the slides for you.
Go ahead. Thank you. You just heard from two remarkable and accomplished speakers, and so now you have to wonder why Justin invited me, because I'm certainly not in that category. I think he was looking for an axe murderer, and someone said, "Hey, Jeff Taylor's a Washington lobbyist. Is that close enough?"
MTS does not lobby.
No, we do not. And as a matter of fact, I will clarify that. It's exactly right. We don't lobby. We don't advocate. Whenever we go to the Hill for MTS, we're not up there saying HR 2121 must pass. We're up there basically to say, hey, we're a resource where we've got engineers and lawyers and business people and academicians, and on these very difficult issues, we're here. And so the more they know that we're here, the more they get more nonpartisan, really true information. But sure. But I thought I would give more of a 30,000-foot level of what happened in Congress earlier this year. And why don't you go right now to the slide that talks, one of the problems with doing your remarks after they've done the PowerPoint is this. Keep going, one more, two more. We're going to get to the point where it talks about one more. Here we go. 25 congressional hearings and 14 committees and subcommittees took part in the aftermath of the oil spill. 25 analyses of federal response and oversight, 13 presidential remarks, 8 White House briefings, and on and on and on. In Congress, there are 4 kinds of hearings. There are the show hearings, which a lot of these were, where it's bring the BP CEO in, let's give every member of Congress 15 minutes to talk and tell how this man is Satan, get on the New York Times, and you're good to go. And that was a good hearing. And then there are the ones that are what called markups, where there actually is a piece of legislation and they rip it apart and get to the final piece of legislation. And then there are the third and the fourth, which are field hearings and what I call really substantive hearings, where the point is not for the member of Congress to actually grandstand or anything, but it's really to pull the knowledge out of the testimony to then lead to good legislation. And I think in terms of next year, when there's a new Congress, this industry's job is to really go after trying to pull Congress to do more field hearings and more real substantive hearings. MTS took part in several of the substantive hearings, and you know, next year if we can do that more, then I think more substantive legislation will come out. And part of that is because of the political makeup of next year's Congress and the White House. You'll see less of these 1,200-page bills that have everything from marine technology to abortion to a health and human services issue, and more of a, this bill does this. Mr. President, do you agree with it or not? If you disagree with it, veto it, and we'll try to figure out how to do it. If you agree with it, please sign it, and let's move on to the next one. So kind of short and precise issues. Right now, let me give you an overview of what's happening in Congress. The Majority Leader and Majority Leader Harry Reid and Speaker Pelosi have all but said that next Friday, and not this Friday, but next Friday, is the day that they will adjourn. So right now, we are looking at appropriations bills that are not done, certainly any substantial environmental bills, but even limited liability issues that would certainly spout out from the BP oil spill. Other things like the defense authorization bill, these are just simply, I mean, unless lightning strikes, just simply not going to be done by the time they leave. So now why are they leaving with all of this on the table? And this, I'm going to digress into a little bit of a political overview right now. The reason that they're leaving so early is because Mrs. Pelosi and Mr. Reid really need to get their incumbents back to protect their seats. Now you hear on NBC News and ABC News what the elections are, how the elections are taking place, and I thought I'd give you a very quick overview of just where we stand on the elections right now, and that might give you and your companies a little bit of an overview of what might actually happen January 3rd when the new Congress comes into session. And if I can find that, I'll tell you what they are. Today, the House will go Republican. Today, there will be a Speaker, John Boehner. Now, a lot can happen in the next month and a half, and it very may well. But right now, if you look at all the surveys of all 435 members that are up in the House, John Boehner gets his quote-unquote 39 seats to flip the House. So again, that could change, but right now that's not going to change. A couple of thoughts on that. There are 46 Democratic seats in this political atmosphere, and you're all aware of the political atmosphere. 46 seats that Democrats hold right now that John McCain won 2 years ago. There is what's called a generic ballot on polls, and that is basically a simple thing that if the election were held today, would you vote the Republican or the Democrat? Republicans never win that a generic ballot. They just simply never do. And in fact, in 1994, when the Republicans took over the House with a 54-seat swing, the Republicans actually that day had a two-point majority in that generic ballot. Today, it's a 10-point lead for Republicans. So that, again, tells you what may happen on Election Day. And then there are the intangibles that must have Speaker Pelosi and the Majority Leader Reid trying to figure out exactly what's going to happen. I'm actually a Republican, but one of my very good friends is a Democratic congresswoman. And she went into the field about 2 weeks ago with a survey and found out that 89% of the people in her district think she's marvelous. Her favorability is 89%, which is unbelievably high. And her dissatisfaction or unfavorable is like in 11 or 12. They love this congresswoman, and she is 10 points down in the poll to a relatively unknown Republican. And so again, Mrs. Pelosi must be like, if she's not coming back, we may be in big trouble. So over the next 6 weeks or so, they're going to try and figure out how they can, reverse and actually, at the very least, get the Congresswoman that I'm talking about absolutely back to Congress. In the Senate, there are 11 Democratic incumbent seats that are below 50% in the polls. And when you have that kind of a figure, most people in electorates, and I'm a former political consultant, when you have a member of the U.S. Senate that's possibly been in the Senate for 6 or 12 years, has 100% name ID, and they're below 50%, and in many cases well below 50%, 43, 45, the people of that state have already made the decision, do I vote for Senator this, or do I vote for some other person? And if that figure 4 weeks out, 6 weeks out, and they're still at 45%, they've decided. And so in the 11th hour, you're going to see more and more people going to the absolute other side. So that's what is going to face. So let's really quickly recap what, in terms of our legislation, the legislation that affects us, will do if in fact the Democrats can pull back some of their losses, and all of a sudden on election day, actually there is still a Speaker Pelosi and a Majority Leader Reid. Clearly the numbers will be a lot tighter, but they will still be in the majority. Let's just say that for an argument's sake. They're going to have a very revitalized Republican Party, and therefore the administration on these key issues that frankly divide parties on a lot of the issues associated with the BP oil spill, whether it's on the environmental front, the financial industries front, environmental front, and other regulatory agencies. They're going to have to actually pull in Republicans in this circumstance. President Bush becomes a real linchpin on this because it's in his best, from a policy standpoint, it's in President Obama, right? What did I say? Bush. Oh, well, I can only hope. President Obama. It's in President Obama's best interest to actually, in his policy best interest, to have Mrs. Pelosi and Mr. Reid as the two leaders again. Because he can still get some of his initiatives passed. Politically, it's in his best interest for re-election to have the Republicans win the House and the Senate, because then he can, for 2012, run against the evil Republicans, and much like President Clinton did in 1996 when he ran against Newt Gingrich and that. So you've got a situation where the policy and the political don't line up for the White House. So, yes?
Yes, Rook, I just flipped back because I know we wanted to talk and make sure folks got a dose of the key player personalities and the regulation. I'm just watching the time. So.
Yeah, no, and I'll wrap up here. But these are some of the. Joe Barton will not be the. Well, they're saying that Joe Barton will not be the chairman if they flip the House. It'll probably be a gentleman named Fred Upton. And Joe Barton probably was not going to get it anyways. But when he said, we need to apologize to BP, that was kind of the nail in the coffin. So it probably is Fred Upton, but these members of Congress are also senior on that committee, and they will play a big role, and that is obviously the key committee that deals with our industry. This is where Brian Baird comes from, Bart Gordon. Ralph Hall is a very conservative, used to be a Democrat and flipped to Republican in the mid-90s, but he is an old-time Blue Dog Democrat at heart that just simply was not there, and here's some of the other members of that committee. And Pete Visclosky, now this is the subcommittee, the Appropriations Committee is massive, but the subcommittee, Rodney Frelinghuysen, is one of the so-called moderate Republicans. So he'll be very approachable on these kinds of issues. But when you really look at, and same thing, Mrs. Murkowski's not coming back to the Senate. She is going to do a write-in campaign. She was defeated in the primary. She's going to try and write-in, but I don't think that's going to happen. Mary Landrieu, the difference between Kay Bailey Hutchison, the philosophical differences in these people are going to be really quite a makeup. The Senate, at this point, still doesn't go Republican. Republicans would have to really run the board. and people like Mrs. Murray from Washington and Senator Feingold from Wisconsin, people who you would just simply never think of losing, would actually have to lose for the Republicans to take over. But all of those members are right now below 50%. And then Dorgan and Bennett. Bennett is no longer coming back to the Senate. He was also defeated by a Tea Party candidate in his Republican primary. And some of the others, and you mentioned Maria Cantwell as a key player on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So I'm going to leave it there. We're going to
touch on these pieces of legislation, or do you want to
Well,
where that, given the uncertainty factor, is it not worth looking at current legislation?
Sadly, that's the case. I mean, just in a nutshell, I think that some good legislation was written in the aftermath, but the oil spill inconveniently took place so late in this particular Congress that once they had the show hearings and once they had some of the substantive hearings, all of a sudden it was late July. They go on summer break from late July to September 14th, and staffers are around, but the members are not around. And so here we are at September 14th, and we've got a laundry list, including all of the appropriations bills, which fund the federal government. They've got to take care of those first. And in fact, they're not going to take care of them. They're going to pass what's called a continuing resolution, which basically keeps us funded until they can figure out how to handle these appropriations bills. So, I hope I've given you kind of an overview of what may happen in the next several months. And then how your industry can impact is to basically gear up for the new Congress, whether or not it's the new Democratic Congress with a smaller majority, or whether or not there's now a Speaker Boehner or a Majority Leader Reid, and really get in there more adroitly and move some of these key committees in a way that it highlights your technology, it highlights, it actually works with authorization bills to maybe even recommend that NOAA move in certain directions. I know NOAA has a problem with that sometimes because you'll have a dentist who's writing the bill suggesting that NOAA do something. But that's very important, and in this next Congress, I think the door will be wide open to just in the aftermath of this oil spill to really explode with some new language on these things. So, Justin, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, we can applaud after the fact, right? And I think the important thing to take out of what Jeff had to say is the pace of activity. Right, so in MTS land, I'm going to pause that for a second. We had our board meeting in May at the Offshore Technology Conference, the very first week of May. So this whole situation was very, very fresh. That was my second board meeting, and I had just gone through this effort to sort of look at our action plan, and we had a vision, and the entire essentially season, if you will, has been shaped differently, and there was an effort to worked very hard to ensure that members, and Fritz is one of our members, for example, and the opportunities were made. All these hearings were happening. So what was happening is we, the Marine Technology Society, certainly me as an individual, was learning on the fly. And we were trying to understand how can we as a society that have diverse interests, obviously, but a shared interest in the ocean and in the wise application of ocean technology, how do we advance our cause? And really, we got lucky and we were wise all at the same time, in that for the most part, we sat back and we observed and we learned and we listened. And what Jeff has been able to help me understand and help our board understand is that there's a lot of things to think about behind the scenes, behind the polls, behind the news, behind the press. And so my objective here was to help bring some of that story and to make you all as members of one or the other societies, or hopefully, if you're not a member, you'll fill out your little form and end up a member of one or the other before you go home. But this isn't easy stuff, right? It's not immediately obvious. There's technical challenges, there's programmatic challenges, and there are these very squishy problems. Those of us who are engineers and scientists don't do real well with these things that are not bound by the laws of physics, right? It's just true. We don't always think that way. So I try very hard to make sure we're always keeping that in mind. I do want to bring us back a little bit to science, technology, and the laws of physics, show you another step in the process. So we had a spill, we had a response, we had an ocean observing community that was trying to contribute to the solution and the response. We had a research community reminding us how little we truly knew about our global ocean planet and these situations. We had all kinds of things going on in Congress and government all at the same time, and now we've gotten a little bit of a moment to take a breath, and this is where I'm gonna apologize, it just sort of worked out this way. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what looked like was gonna happen after the fact, and it just so happens that in my day job with Liquid Robotics, we're a piece of that solution. And in fact, this is this may not be the perfect one, this is a good slide. I will just leave this one slide up and just let you look at it there. So we have an unmanned vehicle that through its use of natural energy has a very, very long endurance. And so we've all acknowledged that things are capped, and it's important that we not, as a science and technology community, let things pause, right? And so fortunately, in our case, BP has put together some programs and sponsored some efforts. So our vehicle that can stay out for up to a year at a time is gonna do that. And on top of that, what's gonna happen, and I'm gonna hop to this slide for a moment. This website, this is pre-release. I'm hoping maybe next week, certainly the week after, it will go from pre-release to real. And what you're seeing there is data. And BP is making it such that this data will be available publicly on their website of initially 2 vehicles. That's what they look like, by the way, before they go in the water with some instrumentation. And you can actually go to their website and read the press release. But the fact of the matter is they're going to be out there. The data is going to be in the public domain. We're making the arrangements to share that data as far and wide as possible. There's, of course, quality control concerns with a lot of these things. But ideally, the IUS infrastructure, Zdenka has spoken about, will be out there. And I certainly hope for our community's sake that we're just the first example and we're not the last. And that we're going to see more tools driven by this, more techniques to listen and monitor and understand the environment. And that's going to feed back to the debate and the dialogue we're talking about in government. So we've really just tried to touch on a variety of different things. You've got several folks here with very interesting backgrounds. And I'd like to sort of shift this over now to sort of a question and answer session. So those of you who aren't interested in standing up, if you've got a pencil, my cell 781-336-9680. You can text your questions in, and you can get those advanced that way. We'll folks swing around here, and I'll wander around here to bring you the microphone. But at this point, you've got, take your pick. Politics, research, ocean observations, new technologies, societies. There's got to be a lot of interesting things to talk about here in the crowd. So we'll start the hand-raising game, and I'll come back and I'll do my best impression of a talk show host back here. So I'm actually going to start with Joe Zika here because he's a colleague of mine from IEEE with a strong interest in this. So.
Thank you. Has there been either in our community or any government agency a good requirements analysis to know, one, what data we need? You know, the response was based on things we have, and so you come to the table with what you had, not with what you needed. And so the question is, do we know what we need, and how should we answer that?
The hearing that I went to that Senator Cantwell organized was actually along that very line. The point that her legislation had in it was that we don't really know what we don't know, right? We don't even really have the list. And I think that's what you're asking, right? Is how do we make the list? And her bill basically proposed to throw a few $1 million at the issue for a couple of years of really digging around and trying to make that list. I actually did find a report that was written for the Marine Mineral Management Service in 1995 or 6 to some, and this report, MMS had asked these people to investigate, well, what would happen if an oil well blew up at the seafloor and it was venting at, you know, quote, deep water. Well, in those days, deep water was 400 meters. This was at 1,500 meters, so even deeper. And some of the things that were actually tried, how many remember the top hat, the original little cap that came down? That was a diagram at the end of this report. And it's sort of a diagram of, well, somebody could make something that looks like this and maybe just drop it down over the, you know, top of it, and we'd put a pipe up to a ship. And of course, they tried that. But one of the things that I really appreciated about these guys is that they were doing engineering in the biggest glaring spotlight the world could possibly turn on them. But ultimately, it did boil down to the fact that that had never been tried. So, you know, the point is, not only do we not necessarily know all that we need, but we don't have a way of funding development to try things and test them before the disaster occurs, and we need to actually respond. And so that's part of the issue, is you not only have the lack of knowledge, but you have the lack of ability to develop and test.
So I'll follow up to say that, you know, certainly from the Integrated Ocean Observing System perspective, there has been, you know, a number of documents that, you know, take a look at ocean observing not for a specific problem or crisis, but the idea of integrating that to support all the problems and crisis. And so there is a basis and a lot of stakeholder engagement. So there is a basis at the national level. There's also the basis at both of the regional level organizations that are there. But it still stays up at that, you know, 10,000 foot level. And we continue to bring that down, but to actually, you know, say we know what we need, and now we've learned from this is a continued refinement that we'll always continue to make. So I think that at least the structure that we have under IUSE allows us to do some of that, and you know, the funds, the resources to do that has been elusive. There are certainly going to be post crisis lesson learned efforts at agencies and across the government. And then there is the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary Mavis, restoration initiative that's out there. And then through the oil spill, the entire NERDA process that needs to go through. So we've got a number of processes, at least for this particular crisis. And the key will be, can we then take that and extend that to what the next crisis might be? Because if we're continuing to look in the rearview mirror, we won't go forward.
For a second and contribute to the answer. Were you going to contribute to the answer there, Craig, too? Okay, well, then we'll cycle back. Thank you, Joe, because you've highlighted one of the roles we're considering for the societies, right? So the answer here is obviously to wade through and look at this from what are the tools available, how do they work, what are they good for, who needs to know about them. These are one of the things that we're thinking about on the society side is the role, and folks can come from here and have the proceedings of this conference, for example, and they can review it. But that's a different kind of tool from an inventory, or there's a different kind of product we might want to come up with there. So definitely thanks, Joe. IEEE and MTS, I think Joe would agree with me. We're in. We want to help be part of that information sharing and that creation. And so I'm going to bounce over to Craig. It looks like Dick's got the microphone to hand Craig.
To say, Justin, what you were saying here. Let me start first by recognizing that the federal agencies that were aligned in order to develop the response and define the question of what would we like to have that we didn't have at the ready, and also the academic community that has been very helpful to bring along our level of understanding of these impacts. What one could describe as what may be a missing link is something that this society or these two societies could provide. So I would like to further endorse the suggestion that the societies take this up, and also to remind us that in the wake of, let's say, the Exxon Valdez or even the Santa Barbara oil spill, as we seem to go in 20-year epics on these major events, which do have societal changes. And the question is, are we playing catch-up or are we getting ahead? Maybe this is the time where we can, having learned this lesson, get ahead rather than just plan for the most recent spill. I think one could argue that OPA, as a body of legislation, planned for a response to the most recent spill rather than being very, very farther reaching. But in looking at that, it took a number of years for the expert community, regardless of who paid their check, whether they were on grants, whether they were industry employees, or whether they were federal servants. It took years to conclude the complete picture, the complete impact of the Exxon Valdez spill and all of the various interactions with other industries that would warrant a series of protections to try and prevent that from happening again. I don't think this situation is going to be any less expedient than that. It takes a lot of deliberative analysis in order to conclude what the situations are. So Joe, knowing what one of your professional passions happens to be, as we've discussed before, and I think that folks need to recognize the talent that we do have in these societies, people who really do spend a lot of their time and their intellectual energy on such problems, Joe being one of them, that if we were to take an IEEE, OES, MTS kind of approach to look at what do the societies think, apolitical and dispassionate in analysis and professional in orientation, at what it would take to have a national inventory of equipment that would be capable of being deployed and how, so that we could understand, measure, and assess what was happening in our oceans. That's a variation on the theme of what standing ocean observing system do we need to monitor our shorelines. But I think that would be a very positive step forward for this body. Thanks for the length of my comment and your patience.
On my way, if I could add in, I believe that several of the oil companies are putting together a trust fund that perhaps some of the results that we have could influence some of the things that they purchase and they set up for future responses. So.
I'm Dean Edwards. I'm with the College of Engineering at University of Idaho. And it seems to me that the big problem here was that this blowout valve didn't work, and there's no contingency plan for that, as was pointed out in some of the answers to the previous question. So it seems to me that you have a single point of failure and no way planned for what to do if that were to happen. Now, one of the things, and actually my son suggested this, is that a fail-safe, and this may or may not be correct, but a fail-safe response to it could have been made if you already had that second well drilled, the relief well. And so if all else fails, you at least have a way of getting and stopping this relatively quickly. But I guess my question to people is what could be put in place now so that if a blowout valve does not work, that rather than trying to respond to it, have something already in place that at least would minimize the damage, if not prevent it. So that's my question.
Yeah, I'm going to let Fritz chime in here because I think he's certainly got some ideas. I will say that one piece of the puzzle that's not necessarily here in the room with us is the depth of knowledge and industry experience that's better able to answer your question. I hang out in Houston every once in a while. I'm certainly not from Houston, and that's not my field. But I can tell you that, for example, a sister conference that the Society sponsored, the Offshore Technology Conference, and the tens of thousands of people that come there is a better forum to answer the technical question I think you're asking. I'm going to let Fritz chime in because he's been thinking about it, just sort of to acknowledge that the nature of our group here doesn't necessarily, unless there's someone in the audience who's from that field and would like to reply, in which case that's great, but otherwise we'll hear from Fritz.
Yeah, the Houston section of the Marine Technology Society is 800 members strong, and I would guess that probably 90% of that membership are in the oil and gas business. So in fact, the society does have that expertise. So directed to your particular question, it turns out that that particular blowout preventer only had one ram mechanism on it, and there are now lots of wellheads that have two rams, right? So there's a backup ram in case the primary ram fails. The other is that there are countries that demand oil well drillers drill the relief well at the same time they drill the primary well. Our country is not one of them. And of course, the oil companies say, well, look, you're going to make us spend twice as much money to do every well just because every once in a while, every 20 years or so, one of these things gets out of hand. And but of course, you know, we don't really know the long-term effects of what one of these things getting out of hand for, you know, 10 weeks is. I will say that they did shut this one down a little more quickly than the last one that was like this, which was in the Gulf of Mexico in 1979. In 160 meters of water, and that literally flowed for 10 months, right, almost a year. But because of the flow rate of this particular well, this well put out a lot more oil than that one did. But it does go back to this issue of having something ready. could we have some national assets, a few big pieces, a few caps that we know how they work, sitting someplace waiting to go into the water?
Yeah, well, so before we turn that one on, I think one of the things you'd hear from a certain element of the industry might be the people who, say, build the rigs and operate the rigs might love the idea of drilling 2 wells at a time. The people who pay for their wells might not, and that would be an interesting conversation we won't get into. But I do want to emphasize what Fritz was getting to, which is the idea of better preparedness and better equipment infrastructure. And if you weren't able to hear entirely, that's, I know, one of Congressman Baird's achievements or ideas that he's advocating in some of the legislation to invest into some technologies and have some resources available. So we can revisit and if you're particularly interested, get you some links to the legislation and the ideas he's promoting there. But I know there's another question up here. We'll come back to you, sir, but I'm gonna turn this one off. You gotta turn that one on and we'll keep the game going.
Okay, I'm actually, my name's Derek White, I'm from OceanWorks. Just talking about some of those relief wells. I know in the Arctic that's a requirement, same calendar year you need to have a relief well drilled. In a lot of ways they were fortunate in the Gulf of Mexico. You had that infrastructure there that was able to help in a lot of the response units. When you talk about the failures of that RAM system, there were 3 RAMs on that. One of the big failure mechanisms that they were concerned about was the concrete as well. You cap that well in, if it ends up breaking through the concrete, going out through the rock face, there's nothing you can do at that point. I think Zdenka bring up a very good point. There's a few areas here. One is the intervention aspects. What do you do if something happens? And the other one is the ocean science, like how is it going to react? How do we end up evaluating that? When you're talking about the instrumentation that's out there, that all has to feed together. It all has to coordinate. And I think a big part of what MTS and NOAA in particular could do is create that infrastructure, that way that the instrumentation can go and feed into a central registry and be accessed so that we can start evaluating it. By the same token, you talk about instrumentation, gliders, rapid deployable subsea units, ADCPs, et cetera, those units could be part of a larger infrastructure that could be deployed wherever it is. You talk about the Gulf of Mexico in particular, there's a lot of information there, and we still don't understand that area particularly well. Loop currents, the thermoclines that were there, the plumes that were riding in the middle of the ocean that no one really considered, I suppose, at the start. When these things happen in a more remote area, and I'll use the Arctic as probably the worst case example, it's going to be a lot more difficult in order to get that information. So.
One thing that I didn't brief is so your point is very well taken, and how do we bring all of the equipment and that we knew that was out there, and one of the things that we did very early on, and I was very concerned about running an ops desk from my kitchen table on a Saturday as we were flying email after email to anybody and everybody on who's got unmanned vehicles, how far do they go, how deep do they go, and what are their sensors. And we literally did that by spreadsheet. And that in the early days of this oil spill was utilized and became very important. But it also told us that we don't really have a good handle on doing a rapid deployment. The structure of IUS allowed us to do that rapid deployment of some assets, not all assets. Then it was, how do you get all that data in? And so again, that structure that we do have both at IUS with our colleagues at the National Data Buoy Center, our colleagues at the National Coastal Data Development Center there in the Gulf, and getting that into the common operational picture and the software that was being used at the National Incident Command Center. That required a lot of folks coming together in theater, and that ended up putting together a joint analysis group of now you got to analyze this data. And as Fritz said, where was it in that 3 dimensions? And that was not something we'd had to do necessarily, had to do in a Gulf, in a spill, or as he says, in this catastrophic event before. So this joint analysis group got put together. And it was interagency. And to analyze all these various types of data. And then it was like, okay, yeah, now we need to really know those subsurface currents. And so Dick Crown on the 4th of July weekend, we got the ADCP plan together. And so you're right, we were able to react to this because some of that structure was there. But that whole discussion of adaptive sampling and rapid deployment and where those assets are, I think is really going to be something that we'll be looking at. And again, with the help of the industry, with the help of the federal, the non-federal partners in putting that together, and how you might do that, from the scientific. And we haven't even talked about seafood and species and all of that. I mean, because we're limited here, but there's got to be a much larger ecosystem view of that and how you're going to bring those assets together. But I think we're going to really be talking about that rapid deployment, a lot of lessons learned and a lot of long hours by very dedicated folks to try to get the observing system up on the fly.
My name is Glenn Williams. I'm from from the College of Engineering at Texas A&M University. I'm going to speak in castigation of and in defense of BP all at the same time. Castigation of because they allowed it to happen one way or the other since they were the operator. Defense of from the time that it happened until the time that it got capped. They were not still. They were not sitting back thinking, we're just going to let it go until somebody comes in and fixes it. They were working 24 hours a day. I talked to several engineer friends from 4 other majors who happened to be working with them around the world trying to figure out what happened. They used all the techniques that they knew had worked in the past. They just don't work at 1,500 meters. The final solution that they came up with didn't happen the day before. That final solution was probably designed and built at least a month before. So it wasn't a case of being still. I think if we want, I don't know that we ever want to get ahead of this, because if you ever get ahead of it, that means you're looking for it on every rig. And I don't want to do that. I think we're going to have to be forced to respond to it. But to me, the key point was mentioned by Fritz, and that is you can design engineering projects all day long until you have a facility to test them and to prove the efficacy of this at 1,500 meters, 2,500 meters, and 3,000 meters, you're going to see the same thing. So we've got to get ahead of it, but I don't think the solution is 2 wells unless everybody wants to pay $6 per gallon.
Zdenka, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you started to allude to the interagency cooperation and the joint response, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the use of the Navy's coupled models in the analysis and also how well those models performed.
Dick, so I can tell you that yes, the Navy models, so the America's Seas model, which is the model that Naval Research Lab, Naval Oceanographic Office was to be tested about a year from now, certainly got accelerated. And they made that available as well as the operational Navy models. And they were, but I cannot speak to how well that they operate. I don't know if I've got any of the Navy folks in here. I've only seen some early information from Frank Bubb on that. What we really, the focus of that particular briefing that I saw was his ability to be able to use the glider information. And part of the coupled, the glider deployment from the Navy perspective was, in part to be able to evaluate their models. And then with the other gliders on and along the shelf, I know the Navy was very appreciative, and there has been direct working relationships with UW and with Rutgers and USF and Moat and, again, being able to bring the data into the GTS, but specifically how the models worked, I don't have that information. But I do know they made it available to the responders. And, Dick could probably speak to the collegiality and the very well, the working relationship on the joint analysis group, and which is one piece of it, but there's also a 10 to 12 person subsurface monitoring unit that was stood up within the first 15 or so days, when the realization of we needed to be able to understand the observations in the 3D. A number of folks, we've had a gentleman by name Dr. Sam Walker, who's been deployed from my office since basically day 2, who was very instrumental, along with a number of the NOAA Corps officers, representatives from across NOAA, various disciplines, and the interagency. And so that became its own unit, and deploying, like I said, I only had a chance to show you some of the deployment. We had, NOAA vessels out there. We had other federal vessels out there. We had non-federal academic vessels out there. We had unmanned vehicles that from MBARI that were deployed. We had aircraft flying daily from NOAA. We had imagery being taken and processed, from all of our agencies. We were flying, shorelines. So all of that got put together, and although it was a subsurface monitoring unit, someone needed to be able to put all that observing assets. So, and that was, again, a very well, represented on the interagency. And inside this unified command center, and the incident command center, because, the on-scene commander down there's got, it's 24 hours. Where am I putting boom? Where am I deploying SCAT teams? Where am I, whatever the question of the minute was. And similarly, at least in our own agency downtown, answering a significant amount of requests all day long, from the White House, from other federal agencies, from the National Command Center. So it all fits in that, but the Navy model is very much used, day to day.
I'm going to leave this on for a second, and I like this. We'll come back to you, Craig. Yeah, so I'm going to paraphrase the question that I got here, because I like it because it's aimed at each of the panelists. And it basically comes down to, from your perspective, right? So the first piece was, if the political situation is so jammed up and chaotic, what recommendation or what hope might one proclaim for some progress? And sort of a similar, if the research community is claiming that, and again, I apologize for butchering the question, but I'm now evolving the question. So it's a kind of a, what's the recommendation, or what's a good goal, right? As scientists and particularly as engineers, we like to work for goals, and we like to deliver on targets. So from a political perspective, what might we anticipate if we do things well? What might we be able to do to improve the regulatory situation or the political situation? What might research look to do, or what questions might research hope to answer relatively soon so that we're better prepared? And what might, perhaps we'll just sort of generalize and say agencies, you could certainly speak to IUCE in particular, but what are some of the steps, the short-term steps that are getting us towards a goal? We've done a really good job here of laying out some of the challenges. We've talked about the challenges. It's a tough, complex environment, and ranging from good solutions and good responses to some struggles. So I'm going to sort of bounce that to each of the panelists. Sorry if as a question clear, do you want me to sort of try to restate? I mean, it's sort of what do we take away? What can we get going on from our multiple different perspectives to bring hope? That was sort of an interesting word.
The most hopeful means that, well, the political is always a mess, but it's more of a mess in the on-election years. So that's why next year would be a better year. It's also the reason why President Obama wanted to do health care in 2009 instead of 2010. It's just easier to do. It's not an election year. And next year they'll face the same challenges. Next year is a great year. One of the questions earlier was, how do we find out what we don't know? And the hearings process is one of the best ways to do that up on Capitol Hill. And now that we're out of the flames of the highly political nature of the oil spill hearings, now the dust is settled. Now that they can get down to Brian Baird type hearings where they really talk about meat and potatoes. And one of the best ways to do this with the two organizations here is to move the 2 or 3 different committees of jurisdiction on doing not just one hearing, but a series of hearings on all of this information. And this is where actually lobbyists and industries all come together for a very good cause. They sit down with the committees, they work on an agenda. When they find out the agenda is certainly more and larger than just simply one hearing on one day, they look into a series of hearings. Okay, we're going to do these 3 agenda items now, these 3 a week and a half from now, and then the following 3 to round out the month. And not only that, they may do actual parts of them, instead of on Capitol Hill, they may do one down in Louisiana or 2 down in Louisiana, and maybe another one up here in Seattle on fisheries issues or something like that. And so that you actually don't get members of Congress, and these types of hearings, the New York Times doesn't cover. So it's okay for a member of Congress to have an actual interaction with a CEO that in another circumstance they may bash, but in this one it's more, let's get something out of here and then let's craft some really good legislation. And then, if we can't get it done next year, then you go back into a political year and, you just simply have the same, what we have now. So next year is critical for all of the groups to come together. You had an environmental disaster this year. It came late in the political cycle, therefore they weren't able to put together some really good pieces of legislation that had a chance of passing. So let's take what we learned last year, let's take some of the drafts of the Brian Baird legislation. Obviously, if it's a Republican Congress, they'll rewrite that, make it into something of theirs. If the Democrats stay in charge, they'll want to get some real good pieces of legislation, positive pieces of legislation, politically friendly pieces of legislation passed immediately, and these would certainly be some of them. And if the Republicans pass, again, they're not stupid. They understand what's smart legislation, and if they can do something focused. But having these hearings and getting Congress to move on these hearings will be valuable.
Yeah, actually, the hearing I was at was along that line of, let's find out, we need to know something, right? So we were all there trying to explain things that we nominally know about. I think from the research and development standpoint, I can hope for 2 things. I could hope that this shines a light on this need for some version of a sort of standing response organization that, even if it exists on paper, at least it exists so that there's some knowledge and pathway to reach out and engage members of the academic community with the appropriate response agencies when the next one happens, because it's not necessarily a matter of if, it's most a matter of when. From the development side, I really hope that some federal money is put into testing efforts or to create add to the facilities that exist, and there are some facilities that exist, and add to the efforts that exist on being able to not only develop but test some of these technologies for either remediation or stopping of oil vent on the seafloor when that 3rd backup ram doesn't work either.
So we focused on the challenges that we might not have the ocean observing system that we want in the Gulf. I think we also need to focus on the positive that we were able to respond. So I would look to the observing community writ large at the federal and non-federal have the opportunity to come together under a singular umbrella. And whether it chooses to be IUCE or another umbrella, but the hardest thing for the policymakers and the budget folks is to hear many independent requests for funding for systems because they can't make sense of and prioritize. So we are better off as a community to come together singularly to determine what it is we need at that baseline operation, observing and focusing on the observing, data management, modeling and analysis, and where we might want to go with this concept of a response. Secondly is I too can appreciate that BP in this case, but the entire oil industry, really was working very hard to bring this disaster to as quick a close. But how do we work? There are two ways we can work with the industry to make sure that the observing capacity that they can bring to the table in a voluntary way, and to make that data that is about the ocean conditions, which doesn't need to be proprietary for their business, make that more open. And if that, would hope they would do that on a voluntary basis. And then there's always working, as MMS has done in the licensing and the legislative, of legislating that mandate for ocean observing in that industry. So we would hope that we could do it from a voluntary perspective. But if not, we will continue to work on the agencies to, or in the legislative arena to put, the types of language in there that we do have the ability to monitor and understand, the effects of such a disaster on the ecosystem.
On Fritz, on federal funding, just a bit on how Congress works. It's nice to have MTS up on Capitol Hill. It's great to have some of the other ocean groups up on Capitol Hill. And I don't want to minimize that. It's ultimately very, very important. But at the end of the day, if we want federal funding to move, it has to be a comprehensive effort of attack at the appropriators and the authorizers up on Capitol Hill. And if individual companies that are here this week go in at different times to those members of Congress and say, listen, our oceans group was in last week, they want to plus up this kind of a fund, and I'm sure you enjoyed their presentation, but I have 400 employees in your district. You need to plus that fund up. It's the difference between an executive director of an association, and I'm talking about any association, National Association of Broadcasters, the realtors, what have you. It's one thing for the president of the association to come through. It's another thing to have a CEO from their district saying, listen, the National Association of Broadcasters, fine. I have 200 employees. I want to make it 400 over the next five years, and you need to do this. And then invite them to your organization, bring your lab coat people in to introduce to the congressman, and really a steady stream. But at all times, you're pounding on the fact that not just that we're voters, but we actually have people in your district that are employees.
Thanks, Jeff. That's actually very helpful. I was going to, that has me, I have two threads to wrap up, and I'm looking at the time, and so we'll end here. But so Jeff did a very good job there in drawing a nice line. MTS, IEEE are in to contribute to a variety of things that we're good at. Community building, sharing a story. You're all hearing this, you're all thinking about it. We'll step back when it comes time for individual organizations, companies to make some of their moves, hopefully enough moves in the same general direction advance the cause. I think the conversations that we've talked about, some substantive things that can be done, and one of the things that I'm very cognizant of, and something I hope everyone takes away, a wise friend of mine once said, everyone should look around and look for 5 or 6 people who are going to come in and do the job you're doing. And if you can't find them, you've got a problem. And I'm very cognizant, particularly in the offshore industry, they face a talent gap. We know that the federal government is taxed and challenged in getting expertise in the research communities. I haven't heard quite the same call for fresh, young talent in the ocean science research arena. But the fact of the matter is we're on 20-year epochs here between these cycles. So what MTS and IEEE will hopefully continue to do is inspire more young people to get into these fields, to be better, smarter, more talented engineers, more networked, more plugged in, more Facebooked, more everything, right? So that we're more responsive as a society and there's more expertise out there. So that's sort of an MTS agenda. We give a lot of scholarships, as does IEEE. And so I'd ask you all to take that away as another message. Don't let this situation, if you know young people looking at a career in the ocean space, or if they were looking at a career even in the oil and gas industry, one way to put it is, oh, isn't that terrible? I'm going to go off and do something else. Or, well, it is terrible and it is unfortunate. You're going to rise up to the challenge and go contribute to the field and use your talents and become a better engineer, become a scientist for the government or for academia, and contribute to the solutions to the problem. And so hopefully we can all walk away and work on that one as well. And I think it's always nice, by the way, there's a story here. In the face of the day-to-day fray of the situation, one of the MTS postures we adopted, the reporters were calling, staffers were calling, that message I just gave you, that was our party line, right? So as a society, MTS said, look, there's lots of technology, there's lots of complexity, we're gonna kind of no comment on whatever your specific question is, but oh, by the way, lots of young people need to be involved, and as a society, you know, I use young people as an emblem of a focus of the society. What's the future of your society? It's where you're directing your youth. So hopefully we're directing our youth into this field, generally speaking, and hopefully the next time something bad happens, as it will, that's just reality, we'll be even better prepared, and our technology and our science and our policy will do us even better than it has here. So thank you all for your attention, for coming. This has been fun. We're going to keep trying to do these. By the way, I'm the program chair for 2011 in sunny, warm Kona, Hawaii. And if you have ideas for things like this we can do there, please come find me. We'll make it happen. So thank you all.
Go out and enjoy the sunshine.